Decades ago, I proposed an essay for National Geographic that would carry me into the primeval forests skirting Poland's border with Russia to witness animals of the sort that Paleolithic artists once painted in ochre on the cave in Lascaux and other places. With luck, years before, I was able to enter that original cave by lamplight and glimpse stiff-maned horses galloping out of darkness, their dorsal stripes and swollen bellies bound only by the anatomies of rock. The world of our early ancestors, with its giant rhinoceros, ibex, stag, wild ox, bison, bear, and other ribbed originals fascinated me, and I wanted to see them. As it turned out, National Geographic sent me to the South Seas instead. But over the next dozen years, miscellaneous facts, lore, insights, and other mind morsels began to accumulate around the idea of the Polish horses. I learned that the forest also contained ancient bison, that Jan Jabinski, the director of the Warsaw Zoo, had been the world's authority on the bison, that he and his wife adopted many orphan animals from the forest, and in time I learned that they were also rescuers. In Yiddish, there is the expression beshirt, that something is just meant to be. To learn about the forest, I needed to email Białowieża Park Service, but I didn't speak Polish. So I asked a neighbor, a Catholic Pole, who had spent her first 26 years in Warsaw, as it turned out, going to the same university that Jan Jabinski did. And she still had relatives there. It turned out that one of her uncles had been a vet at the zoo before the war. We emailed him, and he remembered that Antonina had kept a diary and published it long ago. We asked him to look through his old books and search the city, the used bookstores in Warsaw if necessary, and sure enough, he found it and sent it to us. Then my neighbor translated it for me. And when I discovered the beauty and scope of Antonina's sensibility, her deep love of animals, the texture of her senses, and her persistent acts of courage and compassion, I knew I would have to share her story. So I woke up one day to find that I was coming down with a book. That's how it always happens. A telegram from my subconscious slipped under the door of my awareness. You're falling in love with this facet of life, its minding reads. Find out why and try to capture it in words. And so I rejoined my quest where I'd left it, in the hoofprints of horses and bison and Nazis, and I soon discovered a story as heartful as it was unlikely, which centered around these two newlywed zookeepers, Jan and Antonina, who risked their lives to save over 300 people. Jan was a zookeeper with a grand vision for Warsaw's 3-year-old zoo when he and Antonina were married in 1931. He was a practical zoologist. But it was Antonina who drew me deep into their story because zoo life was her Eden. She identified so deeply with animals that she even named her son Rish, the Polish word for lynx. In the summer of 1939, the young couple's zoo was simply magnificent, but it was also doomed. On a crisp fall day, Nazi bombers destroyed Warsaw, sparing nothing, not even the zoo, which happened to lie near Polish anti-aircraft guns. As bombs whistled down, zoo buildings exploded, moats rained upward, iron bars squealed as they wrenched apart, bullets ripped open the aviary nets, and parrots spiraled upward like Aztec gods and plummeted straight down. 2 giraffes lay dead on the ground, legs twisted, shockingly horizontal. The clotted air hurt to breathe, and it stank of burning wood, straw, and flesh. Echoing around the zoo, the tumult surely sounded like 10,000 furies scratching up from hell to unhinge the world. But miraculously, some animals survived at the zoo, and dozens more escaped down old cobblestone streets while the Capitol burned. The people who were brave enough to look out of their windows on that day reported a very strange sight: hippopotamus and seals waddling along the banks of the Vistula River, camels and antelopes trotting down narrow alleyways, llamas galloping safely beside lions and bears. Writing in her diary, Antonina wondered how many people in Poland would suffer the same nightmare as her zoo animals. Why is it, she asked herself, that animals can sometimes subdue their predatory ways, and yet humans quickly grow more savage than any beast? It's amazing to think that after their zoo was bombed, the Zhibinskys, who could have survived the war and really didn't need to risk their lives and the lives of their children, that they would nonetheless devise such an altruistic and exceedingly dangerous plan, smuggling Jews out of the Warsaw ghetto and sneaking them into the zoo's empty cages. Johan guided them in through a tunnel that led to the lions' cages, and to avoid attracting suspicion, each person was given the name of the dead or escaped animal whose cage he or she was hiding in. Then Antonina could hand her young son a bowl of soup and a hunk of bread and just say, "Go feed the lions," or I think maybe the bears need dinner. Somehow in the midst of this, throughout the war, their hired cook never caught on. What she did report is that the Zhibinskys really started to get larger appetites as the war progressed, and she had to keep cooking more for them. Another 24 people hid inside the Zhibinskys' villa, in the basement, in the attic, between the walls, and even in a high closet with a concealed door. After dark, the household secret guests, she called them, would emerge from their hiding places to socialize, listen to the nightly piano concerts, discuss the war, and laugh at the hijinks of the exotic pets. The innocent distractions of animals drew people into a timeless natural world. Paying attention to the villa's unique ecosystem and routines, they could rest a while as the needs and the rhythms of different species mingled. The zoo vistas still offered trees, birds, and garden. Sweet linden blossoms still hung like pomanders, and after dark the piano music capped the day. This sensory blend grew more vital as dozens more guests arrived from the ghetto with horrific tales of Nazi brutality, and the Zhibinskys embraced them, drawing support from clandestine groups, some very strange indeed. An orphan herself, whose parents were murdered during the early days of the Russian Revolution, Antonina never turned away orphan animals. She couldn't, even during the height of the war. Being able to identify sharply with others came naturally to Antonina, maybe because she was orphaned so young, and with animals she could tap enough of her own experience to gain insight into their pleasures, values, and fears. They were intimate strangers, not aliens. If she also gave them her full attention, mothered them, wished them well, they relaxed in the safety of her care. And she clearly relished folding up her idiosyncratic selves, really, and testing the world from the perspective of other animals, as she does with frisky relish throughout her children's books and memoirs. Unfortunately, they haven't been translated out of Polish, but they are really quite remarkable. It's an odd thing, I suppose, swapping one's animal self for that of other creatures no less bloodthirsty, troubled, or conniving. There's the lure of sensory novelty, with a bounty of new pleasures and frights and games. For a pensive person, shedding thought refreshes the mind. Walking in another's paws deepens empathy and also highlights the rim of our own mortality. We can learn to bridle our lust for territory and power, double-talk fear, turn what arose as monkey appeasement gestures into tactics of statecraft, reword and rewire hatred. The rest of nature doesn't give or expect mercy, yet we applaud altruism and strive to be seemly, merciful, and good. Our animal nature shames us. Not all of us. Antonina believed that people could, should, and often did feature the best of their nature while rising above the worst. There are many ways in which she and I differ, but one way that we really were very much the same and that I feel deep kinship with her is that I've enjoyed looking at the world through the senses of other animals too. And when I began discovering that in her, it really spoke to me. But what are we to make of her telepathy with animals and others? Several possibilities come to mind. In Antonina's day, well-raised Polish women were expected to be highly attuned to the moods and the needs of others, especially their family members. In any era, children who are raised with absent, depressed, or abusive parents often do develop a knack for reading subtle facial cues. That may have been triggered at an early age and etched into her forming brain. There may have been a time in our distant past when we possessed psychic skills that we lost over the eons, maybe to make room for language. A tether of mind reading between mother and child would have been advantageous for our species. Maybe those genes still trickle through some bloodlines and affect certain people more than others. When it came to animals especially, Antonina and Johan both believed her to be a mind whisperer. With the zoo cages and their villa full of illegal people, Antonina, Johan, and Riche raised an assortment of eccentric animals right inside their home. Some of my personal favorites are a carnivorous, predatory rabbit who would attack anybody who was eating sausage and steal the sausage away, a cat whose newborn litters were replaced with newborn foxes, which confused her at first because after all they barked, a playful pig, a muskrat that kept building a lodge in the kitchen stovepipe, a cockatoo with a nervous disorder who pulled out all of her feathers, hyperactive baby otters that slithered all over the floors, hawks, baby lynxes, a mischievous badger, a drunken hamster, hyena pups, and many others, all at the same time. I've often wondered how she cleaned up after them, but no one seems to know the answer to this. Her son loved being a miniature zookeeper. It took his mind off of the war, and his favorite animal slept right under the covers with him in his bedroom. One day when Antonina couldn't find the baby badger, she finally looked under Riche's bed just in time to see Badger pushing Riche's training potty out into the open, climbing on and using it as it was intended. So, what with all the hidden people having animal names, the animals having human names, and the fierce rabbit stealing meat off plates, and the drunken hamster on the dinner table, and the baby foxes everywhere, including on top of the bookshelves, it's no surprise that the Polish underground assigned the zoo the code name of the house under a crazy star. While this was going on, Jan was leading an underground cell of saboteurs who specialized in bombing trains, and he taught biology in a clandestine university, even during the war. They graduated 100,000 students. Time after time, the house's secret was nearly exposed, often while Jan was at work downtown, and Antonina always found a way to outwit the German soldiers. But at any moment, her hidden refugees were only a floorboard away from the enemy, whose voices they heard. Although other Poles were being evacuated from the zoo district, the Jabinskis were allowed to continue living in their zoo because they tricked the Nazis, who let them use the zoo to raise pigs to feed and fur animals to clothe the German troops. And so this bizarre hideout that was part sanctuary and really part menagerie rode out the war, providing asylum for several complete families, as well as many artists, musicians, lawyers, professors, and scientists, over 300 people altogether. I heard from one of them just a few weeks ago. She is a woman living in Israel in her 80s. She was a small child at the zoo hiding. Their success wouldn't have been possible without the unwitting help of two high-ranking Nazis. One was an insect lover who directed the labor office adjoining the ghetto, and there's a famous collection of pinned insects, beetles of the Baltic, which holds the key to this part of the story. I found that collection of exquisitely beautiful pinned insects in an old metal trailer 1 hour south of Warsaw. The other Nazi was a big game hunter. In a thrill of romanticism, the Nazis decided that after the war, the high command would need pure Aryan horses to ride, pure Aryan animals to hunt, and of course, a primeval forest. Hermann Goering, an avid hunter, became the project's patron, and Lutz Heck, director of the Berlin Zoo, became its designer and driving force. Goering authorized Heck to ransack occupied countries for all the animals that looked the most like the ones that the Ice Age hunters had painted on the cave walls 20,000 years before, and try to breed back to their fierce, high-spirited ideal. He wanted to try to recreate extinct animals, or at least ones that looked like them. Heck and Goering pictured elite hunters riding mythic horses, hunting savage bulls, giant bison, and other game in a pristine forest of dramatically tall 500-year-old trees. It was the stuff of Wagnerian operas. Hitler wasn't the first person to think about breeding such master races. In his personal library, he had books by Americans on eugenics. The American eugenics movement began in the 1880s with men who believed in the genetic superiority of Nordic, Germanic, and Anglo-Saxon peoples, and the need for strict immigration policies. If that sounds like the white supremacist movement today, it is. The American eugenics movement was heavily funded by many big corporations, and their membership included such luminaries as Alexander Graham Bell. The Rockefeller Foundation helped to develop and fund various German eugenics programs, including the one that Joseph Mengele worked in before he began working at Auschwitz. Upon returning from Germany in 1934, where more than 5,000 people per month were being forcibly sterilized, one California eugenics leader bragged to a colleague, quote, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program," end quote. So Lutz Heck, the Nazi you saw with the mustache, Daniel Brühl, who was head of the Berlin Zoo, rose in the German version of that movement, and he pursued the quest passionately, ruthlessly. The animals in question were all native to Poland, so was the forest, and at that time Jan Jabinski was the world's only authority on the forest bison. Jan's zoo had great success raising other rare animals. As a nature lover, I was both fascinated and horrified by the Nazi plan to control the genetic destiny of every single life form on the planet. And I've only learned since the book has come out just how detailed the Nazi plans really were. I came upon some diagrams. Somebody was asking me this afternoon how long a period of time the research goes on, and I hesitated for quite a while before answering because it doesn't stop. You become so enthralled, so interested, that I continue to read on the subject, And as I say, it was after the book came out that I found these drawings. And I could see that they intended to drain 100,000 acres of marshland in the Balkans alone and level complete forests, all to produce the best climate for their crops. We worry about climate change today, but they hope to make massive changes in the landscape all over the world. They had it worked out down to the precise angle of rows in the farmed fields. But why did controlling the genetic destiny of the planet matter so much to the Nazis? Nazism hungered for its own private mythology, its own botany and biology, in which plants and animals displayed an ancient lineage that would be undiluted by Asiatic or Mideastern blood. And that meant starting clean, as far as they were concerned, replacing thousands of Polish farmers and so-called Slavic or Jewish crops and livestock with purer ones. Through controlled breeding, the Nazis meant to erase all of Poland's genes from the planet, then move on to other countries, including the US. They even had a botanical commando squad, that's the direct translation from the German, whose job it was to raid the botanical gardens of other countries and steal the best specimens, then bring them back home for breeding. They hoped to alter the world's ecosystems, not only dominate nations and politics, but the whole planet's DNA, thereby changing the spirals of evolution. And of course, it was a goal that legitimized genocide. But paradoxically, the Nazis also revered nature. They were ardent animal lovers and environmentalists. In their era, they were the greenest people leading the world. In their nature policies, they passed far-reaching animal rights laws as they rose to power. Under the Third Reich, animals became noble, mythic, almost angelic, including humans, of course, but not Slavs, Jews, Catholics, homosexuals, gypsies, and some others. Although Mengeles subjects, including children, could be operated on without any painkillers at all, a remarkable example of Nazi zoophilia is that a leading biologist was once punished for not giving worms enough anesthesia during an operation. There's been so much written about the Nazis, but for me, looking at it from a natural history perspective goes to the heart of what the Nazi lunacy was all about. Through their passion for genetics and the natural world, we can see the horror of what they were doing, but also a kind of what might have been innocent obsession with animals and the environment, something that was rather wholesome, all things considered, that happened to be coexisting with a maniacal, sadistic, murderous racism. The Zhibinskys found an ingenious way to capitalize on that paradox. Although Johan risked his life repeatedly and fought in the uprising, he often said that the real hero of this saga was his wife, Antonina, because she combined cleverness and composure with towering empathy and fierce resolve. He said of her that her confidence could disarm even the most hostile, adding that her strength stemmed from her unique love of animals. It wasn't just that she identified with them, he explained, but from time to time, she actually seemed to shed her own human traits and become a panther or a badger. Then, able to adopt their fighting instinct, she suddenly arose as a fearless defender of her kind. His nickname for her was Puma. In her children's books, she writes from the perspective of wild animals, from deep within their sensory awareness. But maybe the most remarkable thing about Antonina was her determination to include play, wonder, curiosity, marvel, and a wide blaze of innocence in a household where everyone naturally feared the ambient dangers, horrors, and uncertainties. That takes a special stripe of bravery that's too rarely celebrated in wartime, when we always seem to equate heroes with violence, stoicism, combat, hatred, rarely with kindness. And yet human beings also perform legendary acts of mercy and heroism out of compassion. Staying emotionally limber enough to love, play, nurture, marvel, despite all the ligatures of war, that takes a rare kind of courage. At the same time, this blend of compassionate heroism was also unfolding inside the Warsaw Ghetto, where Rabbi Shapira urged his flock to transcend by meditating on the beauty of nature and the workings of the mind. I read his sermons, and they're incredibly inspirational and transcendent. It also happened in the ghetto orphanage, where physician Janusz Korczak taught his children to stage transcendent theater and practice mindful Zen-like chores. And it happened at the Warsaw Zoo, where Antonina not only hid a stream of escaping Jews and members of the underground, but ran a household that was filled with music, art, the innocent distractions of animals, and good humor. Surely that courage appears somewhere every day on our perpetually war-torn planet. Why we empathize and act heroically isn't hard to work out scientifically, but why we don't talk about it much, why we prefer to highlight the worst in human nature, I find altogether more puzzling. What fascinates me is how often and with what wholeheartedness ordinary people perform acts of compassion, courage, and sacrifice for complete strangers. At a time when handing a thirsty Jew a cup of water was punishable by death, it makes the heroism of rescuers like the Zhibinskys all the more startling. And while writing this, I couldn't help but wonder, would I have had their compassion? Would I have found their courage? I don't know if I would have. Antonina's story has slipped between the seams of history, as radically compassionate acts sometimes do. I'm happy to report that the villa where she lived inside the zoo has now been turned into a museum, and that she is now recognized as one of the righteous among nations. Her husband was before, but she is now as well. I feel that part of my calling as a writer is to celebrate her generosity, her courage, and her great humanity. There are many forms of obsession. Some are diabolical, some are fortuitous. Out of really terrible motives, the Nazis tried to preserve extinct animals and a wilderness where rare flora and fauna now thrive, tens of thousands of endangered animals. It's a wonderful story of good coming out of evil. And thanks to the Zhibinskys, scores of Warsaw Jews also survived to continue their own ancient lineage in other lands. Antonina and Jan's story needs to be remembered today because these are also days of prejudice, anti-Semitism, and genocide, and because theirs is a tale of radical acts of compassion, something that so-called ordinary people rise to in every era, though we hear little about those dramas. When I began researching the other rescuers, I discovered to my surprise that they all said exactly the same thing that the Zhibinskys said. They said that they didn't do anything special, that anyone in their situation would have done the same thing. It was just the right thing to do. They were actually very modest about what they had done. For their sake, it's time that Antonina and Jan become role models too. Because her story was so dramatic, I wrote it as narrative nonfiction, and to paint the scenes in accurate sensory detail, I studied Poland's natural world, which provided a steady stream of small astonishments. The sights, sounds, and smells of a zoo depend on the animals it keeps, And I had such fun learning the ways of the gibbons and badgers and Arctic hares and lynxes and the other animals that either lived inside the villa or shared the zoo grounds. So many wonderful details loomed on my visits to the modern Warsaw Zoo and the old villa, where I was given the key and could just loaf and prowl for hours. Standing on her second-story terrace facing Old Town, I could survey the city from the same height and angle that Antonina did, especially since the historic downtown was meticulously rebuilt after the war, brick by brick, following Renaissance architectural drawings. I think part of it was that they really wanted their city to be restored, and part of it was kind of flipping a bird at the Nazis, saying, okay, you could level the city, but we are going to rebuild it as beautifully as we did the first time. When I lay down in her bedroom, peered out her windows, stood on her terrace, leaned against its waist-high wall where the salmon-colored tiles collect dew at dawn, when I knelt in what had been Antonina's garden, I could sample the texture of her life. Warsaw's age-old symbol is a mermaid wielding a sword. That's a chimera that I think Antonina would have identified with, because it was a being that was half animal, half woman. What a privilege it's been, peering through the lens of her sensibility, hearing the war through her ears, seeing the natural world through her eyes, and thank you for letting me share a little of that world with you.